girl and praying, God, make me happy and pretty and give me a man who loves me. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me on this program today. That was a prayer of my guest that I'll be talking with. In this conversation, you'll hear about where that prayer came from and how Sue Moore's life turned out very different than she had hoped for. There's all kinds of mess in Sue's story, but there's also a lot of beauty, especially in what God did with all of that. Now, in this conversation, we talk a lot more about the matters in the heart, about how Sue and I and all of us are hungry to be safe, to be seen, to be known. What happens when that gets messed up? How does God call us to healing and learning what healthy intimacy can be? Sue Moore, my guest, is a speaker, a trainer, life recovery model, author, a care training instructor, and coach. She is a founding member of the Greater Orlando Human Trafficking Task Force. She runs a ministry called Forgiven Much Ministries. But we spend a lot of time talking about Sue's story, and I am really looking forward to you hearing this. So, Sue Moore. Well, Sue Moore, what a delight to be with you here today. Thank you for the time, for being here. I'm looking forward to all the things we're going to unpack today. It's such an honor to have you on the program.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for asking. I'm glad to be here.
We met not long ago at a organizational meeting where there were a number of people dealing with areas around relationships and sexuality and intimacy. And as I got to know you a bit through that connection, you have quite a story, and the ministry that God has equipped you to do out of that. We'll talk more about the initials that we see behind you here in a second. But to start with, I believe God usually gives us something to do that's out of what he has brought us through. You have such a story, so I'm just going to give you the floor here for a bit and tell whatever you would like about how did you get to be Sue Moore?
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, knowing that you don't want to stay here for a couple of weeks, let's see. My upbringing was through a Christian home. My mom, the scenario was my birth father died. She remarried a Christian also. He was an alcoholic and there was abuse in the home. We had this duality, one way during the week and another way during the hour of church. So there was this intimacy disorder lingering at that point in time. Obviously didn't know what that was called, but all of the siblings, I was the youngest of four, they all left and went to usually either cohabitation or the military, but left really quickly. And I was by myself with my family, with my mom and my dad. And the isolation and also the longing for relationship. I actually had a prayer when I was a real young kid, tacked on to the end of the now I lay me down to sleep. It was, dear Lord, please make me pretty, happy, and to have a man who loved me.
Wow.
And that's interesting is because I probably was somewhere 7 or 8 years old at the most. And I knew enough then that whatever was happening in this household, I didn't want to repeat that and was asking God to do something different. But the problem was I didn't know how to do anything different. And so in that time frame, that would have been the late 60s, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar was coming up. And then, you could, what is that, the fry, go earn the bacon fried up in a pan and all those good things. And I fell into that.
Yes.
And I was looking to be every woman. I was actually looking to combat some thoughts in my head that my mom and my stepdad had planted, that I was never going to get married, that I was always going to stay home with them. And there was something frightening about that. And I believe unconsciously kind of planning my escape, and became very alert to the ways that women appealed to men and how I could get that Prince Charming. It wasn't, planned out. It was just like, well, I'm going to make my package as much as I could be.
Yeah.
Anyway, fast forward to my teen years, I unfortunately arranged the loss of my virginity, and then had an abortion before I was 16 years old, got married not long after that at 17, and was married 20 years to a man who was addicted to pornography. And yeah, I knew about the pornography before I married him, and was almost instantaneous on the can't beat 'em, join 'em. And I'll prove that I will be every woman to you, and you won't need that anymore. And did not consider at that time, and did not really even know that I had any kind of addiction issues on sexuality and promiscuity until after that marriage imploded. But and then I went back to my ways, and the Lord intervened, thank God. And yeah, and knew not long after that that I was missing so much. And the Lord, drew me to him through his word, and studied and loved his word, and began searching out for recovery information, found stuff for men, didn't find stuff for women, but then read a paper by Marnie Free, and then promptly put that down because I said, no, that is not me. And we were talking 1999 at this point. And yeah, the slow turn of, yeah, that is me. And had gotten promiscuous yet again, still under the cover of being a rededicated Christian, and struggled with that, the romance obsession component. I had some drug addiction issues in my early past, but yeah, just all manner of ways to cope with the anxiety of a fear of being alone, which really stemmed from my childhood.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's a start.
Wow. I mean, we could probably, you're right, spend a long time on many pieces there, but just a couple things I want to ask. You said you grew up in a Christian home and you were going to church regularly. I would guess that you had been told the right things about sex and relationships as far as behaviors, but that didn't seem to translate into the way you behaved as a young person. And then in your marriage, when that marriage imploded and you started acting out again, if I can use that phrase, again, the knowing the right things in your head didn't seem to come out in behavior. That's something I hear from a lot of people, that the facts don't necessarily translate into behavior. Where do you think the disconnect is there? What do you think the barrier is?
I actually would have to say even further back, though, is that, Dr. Carroll, there was no discussion about sexual intimacy in our home. Yes. The conversation about menstruation was very brief in a booklet and passed on very young, and there was really no conversation. And so that, I think, was the biggest gaping hole in the lack of conversation. And what filled that void was the culture.
Yes.
And so the assumption, it really didn't, there was a bunch of duality that took many, many years to uncover, in my Christianity. But there is even innate in following the Lord that there is, the design of purity, and that what you're doing is outside of that, and yet not knowing how, or even, because conversations about sexuality were non-existent. Yeah. Just how then does one find a marriage partner, and what does that look like? None of that was modeled. None of it, especially in the dysfunctional home that I was living in.
You're talking about things that you learned before you knew you were learning them, is what I hear. My words, but that's what you're describing. That nobody sat down and taught you these things, but you absorbed things, very unhealthy things. And you ended up living out of that, not by waking up one day and deciding, I'm going to do this because it dishonors God. That wasn't even there. It was just coming out of the emptiness and all the mess. And the only way you knew to address what you were feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And the one thing that came up on the radar, and it wasn't after, it was in the marriage, when the marriage Well, actually, the story goes like this. Pot was my drug of choice, and I was stoned from daylight till dark for many, many years. And then the Lord, this is while I was married, that it was evident that this wasn't satisfying, and whatever this was, I didn't want any more of it, but I was afraid of what was on the other side of sober. And when I did get on the other side of sober, it was horrifying to take a look at the marriage and the state that it was in.
Wow.
He was not willing to admit that there was any problem with his pornography or with the fact of his drug dependency as well. And it was another 10 years of dealing with that. It wasn't until that time, though, Dr. Carol, that I realized two things. That, well, I think some of this was the religious spirit within the upbringing, is that, God hates divorce.
Yes.
And he created marriage, but there was this innate, God did not design it to operate like this. I didn't know any different. I didn't know any book smarts about it, but I knew that, first of all, he hates divorce, but he didn't design it like this. And so it had me hanging on and hanging on and hanging on, trying to fix that marriage, and a lot of codependency things going on there. But to go back to your question of how did the spiritual or religious side of that impact my walk, I really didn't start seeing it until the marriage troubles became so obvious. And what do I do with this now?
Okay.
And then having to walk that journey.
So when that marriage imploded, you had a period of, as you described, promiscuity again, and then God got a hold of you, and you walked that journey to follow Jesus more completely. What was it in your soul that said, I can't live like this? Was it the pain? Was it feeling or coming to understand God had something that was good? And what was the primary driver in you that led to a change of direction?
I saw that I was repeating old patterns. Back in those days, we had cassette tapes.
Yep.
And I had this statement is that I could put in the tape, fast forward to the end. I know how this one's going to turn out. I knew myself. I'd seen the pattern for so long, unfortunately, that if left to my own demise, that relationship after relationship, I'd compromise myself. We'd be sexually involved. I would hang on for the romance or for the love that was in it, and not be valued as a person. And honestly, I didn't know then that, what my value was as a person, because in order to be seen, it appeared up until this time, I had to be sexual. I had to be acknowledged for how I looked, my body image, and we measure this to some degree, a lot today as well. If we have someone, we're in relationship with someone, then apparently somewhere in my psyche that tells me that I'm more valuable because I've attracted someone here.
Sure.
And so there was that romance for that I'm valuable if I've got someone with me, and just saw that pattern over and over again, and just how empty it was and how I became depleted after each one, and just going, I don't know how to do this differently.
Yeah.
I really don't.
You have a short written out testimony on your website. And one of the things you said there is that sex was the only way you knew how to get love.
Mm-hmm.
That really just, it got to me, because it, I believe, speaks to the empty hole we all have. And whether it's sex, which sadly in today's culture, that's what's offered to get love or affection or intimacy or whatever, that's what's on offer. But as you've described in your story, it didn't pan out that way. Before we get to the ministry God has you doing now, that marriage ended and you were not married again. So you are living as a mature, adult, unmarried woman. How are you dealing with those parts of your heart now?
Well, the Lord and I got very close over this. I mean, there are some very good conversations, that if I can be candid, I'm assuming I can be on
Yes,
your show.
absolutely.
So I really didn't realize a lot of my problems arise after, I stopped having sex with others. And this was before groups and all of that came along. Stopped having sex with others. And again, as I'm doing this, my love of the word of the Lord, and studying him and his word, just started, compensating. I'd let go a little bit of the world and draw nearer to God, as he talks about. But then this, stopped having sex with others. And then there was this masturbation habit that had to be dealt with. And because it was becoming less satisfying as well. And it wasn't until that one had to be handed over to the Lord as well that I realized how angry I was at God.
Yes.
And it was interesting how I can say this now, and I speak this a lot to our women. Just our stories are powerful, but it wasn't until then that I realized that I was angry at God for the choices that I made. Because remember, there was a little girl that said I wanted to be pretty and happy and have a man who loved me. And yet I kept choosing men that would not love me. They loved what I would do for them and all manner of other things. And so I was angry at God for not having that. And of course, I learned at that point in time that God was big enough to handle my anger. And it was at that time that I learned that I started handing over all of these things to him that I was seeking comfort for in this world. And whether it be, relationships, masturbation, sex, work, performance, I mean, I've gone through the gambit of all of those things. But as a single woman in the height of hormones at that age, there were some deep longing periods, wanting to be held, not having anybody to hold you.
Yes.
I've got some good stories on that and how the Lord met me in those moments. Some of those, if you went back to the absence of the masturbation habit, I've often called this the skin peeling experience, and that doesn't sound very delightful at all, but it is. You have to go through that period to get to the core of what's driving your addiction. And it was this sheer fact of fear of being alone, and then realizing I'm not, and then discovering who I am, and that investment, the singleness. And as I talk with women today, we really have to invest our time into who we're becoming, who God is calling us to be. There's obviously great value in finding out where we've been and all the compromises that have led us to this place. And then shedding those is, I tell my women is that, we don't often leave this lily pad to jump to the next one until that next one is very clear. And what it offers is better than, it has to be more appealing than this one, because I'm not about to leave this one to go to that one until I can trust it. And so there's this development of vision of this woman that you're becoming. And there are some tactical and practical things that, I teach and talk through to get them there. But it is, if at that point in time, I was compelled that if God is going to bring someone in my life, they needed to be heading in the same direction that I was heading. That I knew enough that if I compromised this becoming all that I could be, then I would be compromising this almost magnetic type of draw of what God he's calling me up to. And compromising that for, obviously it would be more than a hug now and then, or this, but it's more than that. The marriage relationship, the intimacy between a man and a woman is designed to be much more than that. It's much more than a sexual interaction, but it's that transparency of becoming known, that I have no secrets with you, but I've got to first have to have no secrets with me, and I have to share that with my Lord. And then when I've got nothing hindering me here, then I can have nothing hindering me here. And that was the pursuit of, well, okay, I don't see anyone running alongside me at this point, and I really don't want to stop this pursuit. I just felt compelled that God had breathed life into me and fashioned me, as well as everybody else, specifically in this point in time, and I was worthy.
Yeah.
I had value, and I had to start learning how to see myself that way. And it's taken a while. And mind you, at that point in time, I was in my mid 40s, early 40s, mid 40s. And withdrawing is probably the better word, withdrawing from the cultural interactions of a single woman in her 40s and the expectations of involvement, whether you consider that inside the church or out. It was obviously different. And I swam upstream a fair bit, but was convinced that if God said this to the ladies as well, look, if God parted seas and he did all these miracles, he is very capable of planting my husband in my path, in my sphere of influence, that I'm going to see him. I do not have to manipulate circumstances to find him. And that was the conviction of my heart.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. One thing that you've described in a number of these steps that are there in your story, you didn't stop the sexual behaviors, excuse me, by just trying harder to do so. You were going somewhere else.
Yeah. That has to be a part of it. Replacing behaviors. Yeah, we can start that one. That has to be a part of it. Replacing behaviors is just behaviors. I have to deal with what's going on inside, and what's going on inside is a mirror looking for my value. I'm going to be looking for my reflection off of something somewhere.
Yeah. And
either it's going to be the mirror I'm passing, or your eyes, or their eyes, or whatever not, or it's going to be my Lord. And I'm convinced of one of those. And it's not as black and white as that. It does happen in more of it's just not as linear. There's a lot of loops and ups and downs in that journey.
I do want to spend a few minutes talking about Forgiven Much Ministries, the initials behind you that we're seeing. Talk a little bit, first of all, about what that is, and then I want to ask a couple questions about some of the things that you teach. So what is FMM?
Well, Forgiven Much Ministries, we are predominantly I am a compiler. I like to compile. That's just how the Lord's wired me. We're a resource. We're an educational resource. My heartbeat is to equip laypersons with a confidence of literacy so they are able to serve out of their story. I think that's the short answer. Forgiven Much Ministries actually got its name. I want to share this with you, and it was very humbling. I knew I was going into ministry. I was in my 2-year Greek and Hebrew course, and headlong toward the Lord, a young man asked me out, and I went to dinner. We held hands, and it was all over. And when I say all over, I fell. And I was so heartbroken over that. And the Lord, I I was heartbroken over the fact that I had fallen because I was so in love with my Lord, and that I would compromise that over. It just took me back, Carol. And I learned several things through reflecting on that moment. One of which I learned a respect for the intensity of our sexuality.
Yeah.
Just the respecting of it alone, of knowing the power of it, and to take great care in protecting the environment that I placed myself in. But it was at that moment that I pretty much, in my conversations with the Lord, felt like, I don't know how you can use me. And was going to church. Long story short, at that point in time, I remember brushing my teeth and getting ready to go to church. I had several days to sit in the ache of my heart with this, but it was at that moment that he put the story of the woman who was washing Jesus' feet, and she loves much because she's been forgiven much. And it was as clear as day. That was the name of the ministry. And so from that point forward, I knew that I was to speak about sexual addiction and plant support groups. And in order for support groups to happen, people had to have, it seemed, in the trajectory of where the Lord has taken me and what I've been able to glean and what he's poured in and all, but men and women tend not to jump into this arena for fear they don't know enough. And so I was wanting to provide and compile all the information that was taught to me through my accreditation, and anything from CEUs and everything the Lord's taught. And so I just compile this stuff and give it freely to them, on the website. And if they want to have workshops or cohorts or whatnot, we do that as well. But in order to equip them to where they will have a shame-free witness. And that's just huge. The Lord put that on my heart last year, and it was very compelling, and I hang on to it since, is that we, within the body of Christ, we're moving in the right direction. It seems to be a slow moving train, but we are moving in the right direction to provide people that environment to where they can have a shame-free witness. But forgiven much, whether it is providing a forum for them to have, workshops to learn about developing healthy intimacy skills, or what God's design for sexual intimacy is, or what sexual development is, or all manner of things. It's giving them an entry point into that. If they need groups, point them in that direction. If they'd like further learning, point them in that direction. And the Lord has recently opened a door that I'll be starting in the faith community, which I'm extremely tickled about. That's been many years of prayer, but we're going to be talking about a 12-week course. And in the Bible Belt of this United States, we'll be teaching on gospel-centered sexuality. 12 weeks. Carol, 12
That's
weeks.
awesome. That's
It
awesome.
is. It's like, yay, touch me. 15 years of praying and we're there. It's like, yes. And so, yeah, just teaching what I've learned. And the Lord has poured out a lot, and he always does, but just sharing and everything that he's taught me.
Well, I spent some time looking through part of your material. There is a lot. And what stood out to me was how you have brought the deep things of God, not just plastering over, just try harder, but real cooperating with God in the process of transformation, and some understanding of addiction and how people change and what sexuality does in a person's mind and body and soul. You brought those things together in a process that helps people walk through what's really hard and really find change. I wanted to ask you about a concept you referenced, and as you were describing this, and that's the idea of healthy intimacy. I think from what I see of humans and the people I've talked with and worked with, that's a need we have right our whole life. It starts when we're very tiny, but nobody wakes up and thinks, oh, I need intimacy today. So what is healthy intimacy, and all the ways it's gone wrong? How can people learn to become able to experience intimacy?
Those are so good questions. I boil it down to one word. In scripture, it's yada. It's in the Hebrew. Strong's 30:45, to know and become experientially known. And that's, when I was talking earlier, that's having the no secrets, being safe in relationship, that I can, we know in this world, we have, in the carnal world, we have the experiences, we experience them through our senses, and then our soulish realm, we interpret those, we have perceptions of those, and that develops our belief system. And we need to have the outside measure from the spiritual realm, the standard and measure of God, to be able to ascertain, truth and a lie, that type of thing. And as a young child is in a family, as you all know more than I do, I'm certain that, neurobiologically, we're needing to be seen. We need that seen, soothed, safe, and secure aspect of it. We desperately do to get that attunement to all things are well with the world. And in that safety that all things are well with the world, I have a place that I can share my interpretation of that experience to ascertain, is that true? And that intimacy, I mean, that's probably way heady than what you were looking for. But no, that's not in a book that we teach parents, and it ought to be, but that's that safety that child is looking for. But if you translate that onward through a person's life and their desire to have intimacy, we're wanting to be able to share an interpretation of an experience. This thing hurt. This thing was glorious. This thing was, you put a label on it. I want to share my interpretation of that experience. And we're looking for a mirror of measure. And when those things are askew, when they're harmful, when they're dark, and we are not able to have a safe place to communicate. We'll just use my family as an example, the dysfunction of my family of origin.
Sure.
To be able to determine, hey, that was pretty bad what was happening last night. What was going on? My sister wasn't safe. Being able to identify that was a bad thing that happened, and have a safe place and be calmed down and to regulate again, as we call it, clinically. None of that happened. Yeah. And so you're left to your own demise of figuring out, in drawing conclusions, and then coming into this, well, life is as it appears to be. Well, and then you get the Christianese that, God is good and God is in it. And so, like, where is God in this? In having to learn how to, now we know as we grow in maturity with the Lord that we call in him, he is here in all of those things. But this intimacy, in my view, is our learning to become known in that moment, and being able to express a feeling and process the pain of that moment, and then be able to acknowledge, weaknesses and strengths even. But as we're in relationship, we are looking for a mirror of God's. I believe we're looking for God's reflection and his revelation of his opinion on us.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's our job as Christians in being made in his image. And sometimes we don't know how to do that. And we mirror our own opinion, which sometimes hurts that individual. But we're looking for this true essence of intimacy where I can be heard, I can be understood. It's safe. I'm free from fear. I'm free to explore, take new risks, I'm accepted, and all that. And when I don't feel that this environment is safe, and I don't feel chosen, and I don't feel included, or I don't feel heard, that I need a safe place to be able to communicate that. Yeah. And I need skills to learn how to do that, because we don't come out with those, and nor do many parents come equipped with those. But I don't know if I got anywhere near close to the answer what you're looking for, but the coping to healthy intimacy, the point of that signature statement is we will cope with the anxiety of this world one way or the other. There is anxiety in this world. In this world, you will have trouble. I didn't like that piece of scripture. I wanted it to go away. But then he does say that he's overcome the world. Okay, I've got to figure out then how am I to do that? And that, to me is in that sweet space of the perfect love of God that casts out all fear. And I'm in that safety spot. But if I'm not residing in this abiding love of God that keeps me safe, this all-knowing, knowing me before time, in time, out of time, that kind of stuff, then I am going to cope with this anxiety one way or the other. I'm going to do it in socially acceptable ways, which no one is going to mess with me on, and my workaholism will be a great way to manage that one. And we've got a litany of ways that we do that. Social media could be romance, could be sex, it could be family, it could be codependency. It's a multitude of things. So we go from these means of coping to healthy intimacy, and the vehicle between is learning that there is some anxiety going on here. What's provoking it? Is it a real threat, or is it an imaginary threat? Does it remind me of something from days gone by and I think it's going to repeat itself? Is it going on in my head? But freeze framing that moment and identifying there's some distress going on, and it's trying to, obviously this is the adversary. He's trying to get me out of my sweet spot, this perfect love of God that casts out all fear. And he's wanting me to go vindicate myself in my own power. And doing that by any of these means of coping. So we're going from that natural self-vindicating state to residing in this, wait a minute, let me push pause for a second. Let me discern what God's best interest is here for me in this. And I'm going to choose to protect that. And that is a skill set. We teach that in the reflective listening exercise. And it starts with the pressing pause, that tolerating anxiety, as Bowen theory talks about. Anyway, I get on my soapbox. I love that kind of stuff, but I think will get us started anyway.
That's really good, Sue. That's really good. I love how you described it as a process, that this isn't something we're born knowing how to do. The majority of parents may not know how to display it. They certainly don't know how to teach it, but that it is learnable. It's something that our systems, God created our systems to do intimacy, if I can put it in those words. And so the process to learn that, it's possible, and real well-being comes out of that. You're talking about relationship with God in all this, which I so appreciate. And I did want to ask one more question about that. You described your own experience as coming to realize you were angry with God for the things that had ended up harming you that weren't God's fault, but your experience of feeling angry with him. I'm sure that various brands of that show up in most, if not all of us. We don't, in the emotional part of our being, feel good about God completely, not 100% good. What was the process like for you to move past that? And how do you talk to the people that you serve in dealing with that?
Yeah. Very good questions. I remember back during that time, and the scripture citation, it's in Psalms, but delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart.
Yeah.
And I had that verse. It's stuck in some dried flowers in a jar somewhere still in my belongings of memorabilia. And as I was maturing in the Lord and going through that phase of anger, it was disappointment, just the disappointment that things turned out the way they did. Now, mind you, I had to take responsibility for the choices that led down that road.
Sure.
But this idea of delighting in the Lord, and he would give you the desires of your heart. And so I started on that journey, and down the road a bit, I realized, you, I see what you're doing. You're changing my heart. It was my heart was changing because in the beginning, again, the pretty happy man who loved me kind of thing, I was still in the very early days. And when this was going on, was still hoping for perhaps, someone out there for me. And that was still on the radar of desires of my heart. But as I was maturing, I was realizing that was somewhat of an idol that I was placing up. And it was in the place of the intimacy, this marriage, I'm going to be valuable if I have this is going to bring me security. Yep. Honestly, it was more security than anything. It brought security to the value of self and all this other means. But as the Lord was bringing the understanding of delighting in him, and that is, oh my gosh, even since that moment to now, that has been, the growth has just been immense, is that it's seeking him, and all these things will be added unto you type of language. And we know this in Christianese.
Yep.
But I didn't know it for fact.
Yes.
Until I was walking it, and I've made this statement: you put all your chips in the middle of the table. I had nothing. When I went into full-time ministry, I mean, those moments that I were just talking about was before full-time ministry, but it really got rubber hit the road in full-time ministry on several points. First of all, it's sexual addiction ministry. And I am a female, and I knew full well where I was headed and where I was going. But I also knew at that time that I all but shut that door for a man to come in my life, because when it's just one of those for real things, even in the Christian community, when you talk to someone about, hey, when they ask you at the table and everybody's saying what you do, and you say, I am a sexual addiction specialist, and it becomes crickets around the table. You have to learn how to deal with that. Yep. And at that point, that if God does want to place someone in your life, he is all powerful and he can do it. I knew when I stepped into ministry that if it was his design, it was his call. I wasn't going to, I have no conditions on my employment, is what I used to tell him.
That's good.
And every now and then the whisper comes back, and I think I jumped from your original question into that, but it's the delighting in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And the desire of my heart must have first and foremost have been to feel safe and at peace. Mm-hmm. Because honestly, that's where I'm anchoring in. And I've been asking him at this point, I want to know more about this, staying in this perfect love of God that casts out all fear, and not bolting out of his perfect presence to go manage things in my own power. It's senseless to do that. And it's automatic. And sometimes, and I have to, wait a minute, I'm not in safety zone here. I got to get back in with the Lord. But it's amazing how the Lord teaches us step by step, and sometimes repeats because we need it, and we've made boo-boos. But Carol, I think I went way off topic there, so I'm giving it back to you to bring us back to where we ought to be.
Well, what a beautiful place to point to is that feeling of safety, and that doesn't come, in your case, with sex with a man, doesn't come in marriage. It starts, or it must be anchored, if it is to be real and lasting, that sense of security, safety, being seen and known really is with God. Yeah. And I think he cares much less how long it takes us to get there, that we get there. Mm-hmm. And we are privileged to help people along that journey. Just finally, Sue, if people are intrigued by your story, and especially about Forgiven Much Ministries and the resources that you have done so much good work in compiling and writing and making available, where can people find you?
At forgivenmuchministries.org. Okay. Simple enough.
All right. We'll make sure that link is under this video if you're watching. It's in the show notes if you're listening. Sue, I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface on the process of not coping, but finding healthy intimacy. And I just thank you for being real with your story. First of all, we spend a lot of time on your story. And that is just so precious because all of us have stuff, and you have brought your stuff and said, here, take it, do what you want to with it. And he has. God has done so much, and now ministering to others. We're honored that you have been with us today. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Carol. It's my privilege. God bless you.
Oh my, if good can come out of Sue's story, it can come out of yours. If Sue can learn about healthy intimacy, you can too. Do check out forgivenmuchministries.org. The link is under this video. Would invite you to check that out. There is a wealth of just deep and good information there. We'll also link to a couple of resources from Dr. Carol Ministries about what true intimacy is and what pursuing intimacy, especially intimacy with God, can be. A couple of our blog articles. I would love to hear from you. If you come to the contact page on drcarolministries.com, you can leave a confidential message and I respond personally. I would also love you to leave a comment under this video. I read everyone and love to interact with you here. Do subscribe to this channel so you can get the material that we put up here regularly, usually each week. And until next time, may God bless you.